Mr. Thirkill's Guide to Essays, Part 2, Paragraphs, Sociology Edition. Rule number 1, GCSE strategies do not work at A-level. So even if you've got an A star, you need to abandon those successful strategies from the past because they will not work. The typical GCSE answer is made up of 3-part paragraphs. So these could be called PEE, PEC or PEA, all of which are great at GCSE. But remember, rule number 1. So, some differences between GCSE and A-level. Firstly, PEE is your enemy. Secondly, you need named sociologists. It's simply not enough to say, some sociologists say. Thirdly, we need proper examples. Fourthly, we can't state, we need to elaborate. So you can't just give the stuff without developing it. And lastly, and most importantly, you cannot just juxtapose. You must criticise, compare and contrast. By juxtaposition, I mean that when you put two things into opposition, but do not compare them. So this is your on the other hand style of answer. It's not making a counter-argument, it's just another statement. So for instance, blue, on the other hand red. Red, blue, red, blue. This isn't a real argument, just a row. So how can we turn this into an argument? Firstly, you could say that red is more eye-catching than blue. Or you could say that blue goes with somebody's hair colour better than red does. These are actually arguments because we're giving a characteristic of blue or red which is superior in a way to the other. So, how do we write good paragraphs at A-level? We need to creak. So this is made up of the following parts: claim, reason, example, evaluative comment, counter-argument, conclusion. And you can see here that they get different assessment objective marks. A lot of students find they write lots for the claim and the reason, they write a bit for the example and they neglect these parts. But you need all these skills to get full marks. And essentially the creak is a way of getting the best marks across the entire essay by doing a number of miniature essays. So let's take a look now at the different parts of the creak. For starters, we have the claim. This is the argument, usually a point of view. Try to include a named sociologist. For example, Marx argues that religion is the opium of the people and exists to compensate them for their alienating existence. This is followed by reason. The reason develops the claim, explaining what the claim means more precisely, demonstrating understanding. E.g., by this he meant that religion acts like a pacifying drug which the proletariat self-medicate with to cope with capitalism, but that helps sustain the system of exploitation. You can see this develops the earlier opium of the people point. Moving on, we have the example. This is a piece of research or a real-world example that backs up the claim. These can sometimes be quite general or hypothetical, but ideally should be immediately understandable. Examples demonstrate understanding, not knowledge, and these get us AO2 marks. So, an example of an example. For instance, many religions, including Buddhism, Hinduism and Methodist Christianity, stress that duty, obedience and quietism in the current life will lead to happiness and fulfillment in the next. Similarly, black slaves in America were taught that the meek shall inherit the earth, i.e. to do as they are told. And you can see how this example connects to our earlier claim. The example is followed by an evaluative comment. This is an interpretive comment that connects the example back to the claim. It's not an evaluation of the claim. That comes later on. So, in stressing salvation through compliance and pie in the sky when you die rewards, these religions discourage the proletariat from seeking justice in this life, i.e. political opposition. Following the evaluative comment, we now switch to the counter-argument. This is an opposing point of view, theory, concept or example that undermines and contradicts the claim. E.g., the claim is wrong. The claim is correct but only applies when X, Y, Z, so it only applies in a specific situation. Or, the claim doesn't matter because P is more important. The counterexample cannot just be a juxtaposed alternative. The counter-argument has to be used directly to undermine the claim. So, functionalists disagree with Karl Marx isn't really a counter-argument, just an alternative claim. The claim should be around 40% of the creek and usually contains a sociologist and a counter-example. An example claim. However, there is considerable evidence of religion being a stimulant to the proletariat and other marginalised groups, rather than an opiate. For example, Antonio Gramsci and Otto Maduro discussed the possibility of using the Catholic Church as a vehicle for opposing the hegemony of capitalism, as a mechanism for politically educating the proletariat and rule peasantry. For instance, liberation theology in Latin America and African American churches in the Deep South were important supporters of opposition to civil rights movements, so much so that religious leaders such as Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, Malcolm X and Archbishop Oscar Romero were assassinated by reactionary conservative forces. This does not support religion as a pacifying opiate. And you can see how this isn't just a juxtaposition, it is directly taking you back to the claim. Lastly, the conclusion. This isn't the final conclusion to the essay, it's a mini-conclusion which weighs up the relative merits of the claim and the counter-argument. Who wins and why? 3 possibilities. 1. The claim is broadly correct. 2. The claim is broadly wrong. Or 3. Most interestingly, both claim and counter-argument are missing the point. This could be a twist. For example, both Marxist and neo-Marxist arguments see religion in terms of its macro, structural aspects and effects. Alternatively, we could choose to examine it in terms of its psychological use by individuals. For example, Bronislaw Malinowski's Trobriand Islanders use religion almost cynically. When taking a big risky fishing trip, they would suddenly get religion, but forget about this as soon as they had returned home safely. This suggests that religion has as many functions as individual believers, and that it is not one thing or the other. Final points. The creek contains AO1, AO2 and AO3, and therefore it's a very good structure for maximising all types of marks. Secondly, it gets harder as you go through the creek. The claim is normally easy, the CO is normally the hardest. At AS level, the conclusion is an A grade skill. At A2 it's a C grade skill. So if you're not managing to make mini conclusions throughout, don't get too upset about that. It probably means you're writing a B grade, which is good. Point 4. You need a longer example and counter argument for 33 marker questions at A2. So we're looking really for 2 examples and 2 counter arguments. Lastly, the number of creeks varies depending on the essay that you're talking about. So a 33 marker will have a different number of creeks to an 18 marker. Ask your teachers for some advice on how to go and structure it, the number of creeks. Okay, so next time Mr. Thirkill's Guide to Essays, conclusions. Stay tuned.